Hi everyone, I'm Catherine from the Ridgefield Historical Society. I'm delighted to welcome back Terry McManus, archivist and historian of the Ridgefield Garden Club. Terry will give part one of a two-part presentation about Anne Richardson and Anne's Ridgefield Estate and Gardens. Hi Terry, it's nice to see you.
Hi Catherine, it's so good to see you too.
I'm so happy that you're back and delighted for everybody to see this new presentation. So take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pull it up here on the screen. All right, one moment. Okay. Well, I am so happy to be here today to share this presentation with you. It's part one of a two-part presentation about Anne Richardson and her McManus farm, which was her large Ridgefield estate up on the north side of town. And Richardson Park occupies part of what was her estate today. Anne was a 50-year member of the Ridgefield Garden Club. This presentation is based primarily on materials that we have in our archives, which are beautifully stored at the Scott House. Our collection dates back to 1914, and we really appreciate the opportunity to store those. So thank you very much to the Ridgefield Historical Society for that. What I hope to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to give you a very brief introduction to this absolutely amazing woman. In the 50 years that she lived in Ridgefield, she was a suffragist, a world traveler, garden club leader, a civic leader, and a philanthropist. So that's a lot of material to cover in 15 minutes. It'll be a bit of a whirlwind tour. Anne was born in Bridgeport in 1884, and she lived there until she moved to Ridgefield, which was in 1915. So she was about 31 years old when she moved to Ridgefield. It was a couple years after her parents had died, and when they died, she inherited millions of dollars. She grew up not realizing that her family had that kind of money. She was actually a working woman. She was a supervisor at a corset factory in Bridgeport. But she moved to Ridgefield in 1915. She built her estate, which again she called McManus Farm, at the north end of McManus Lake. And she moved here with her longtime partner and life companion, Edna Scheuer. Edna was also a member of the Ridgefield Garden Club for many years, and you will be hearing a lot about her today because they really were inseparable companions. So we'll first talk about Anne as a suffragist. Again, she moved to Ridgefield in 1915, which is really the height of the women's suffrage movement at the time. Almost 100 years ago now, almost exactly, in 1920, women won the right to vote. And Anne was one of the founding members of the Ridgefield chapter of the League of Women Voters. If you go to the League of Women Voters website for Ridgefield, this is the Facebook page, but on the website, they have a document that profiles 5 early leaders of the suffrage movement here in Ridgefield. And among those 5 are Anne Richardson and Edna Scheuer. Anne and Edna were members of the League their entire lives. Edna was actually the first president of the Ridgefield League of Women Voters, and she was president for 13 years until 1933. Anne and Edna were world travelers. They had very good friends in England, so they went there regularly. Edna was very involved in the United China relief efforts in the early 1940s, and they traveled regularly to China. They also had made trips to Africa and Asia, to Australia, New Zealand, to Russia, to the Middle East. When Edna died, which was in 1946, 20 years before Anne died, Anne sort of lost some of her love of travel, but she did continue to make a couple other trips. She took a boat trip down the Amazon River, and while she had always wanted to climb Mount Everest, she didn't actually get a chance to do that, but she did get a chance to see it. Our Garden Club archives don't include any images from these world travels, but we do have a number of images of their travels throughout the United States, which they also did extensively. I'm going to start with a clip from our archives of the Garden Club of America's annual meeting in Seattle in 1930. And this is a film taken by Edna, which the clip I'm showing you is on their travels getting to Seattle. Of course, in 1930, it would have been by train. And here they are at the Canadian border, taking a bit of a break in the ride. And here we see Anne Richardson walking toward us. She's the tall woman. Anne stood over 6 feet tall and had a very commanding presence. We also have a clip of their 1932 trip to the Grand Canyon. And here we see Anne Richardson in the white hair and the black cap as she looks out over across the Grand Canyon. The earliest image that we have of Anne Richardson in our archives was taken in 1924, and this is at the Garden Club of America's annual meeting in Jamestown, Virginia. In the middle of the photograph, and I'm going to zoom in here, above that big umbrella in the front is the very tall Anne Richardson with a very big wide-brimmed hat. And in addition to being known for her height, she was also known for wearing very large hats. As I mentioned, Anne was a member of our garden club for 50 years. She was also a leader of so many different committees. One of them was our exhibitions committee. Our club has always been focused on promoting gardening and growing trees and shrubs and flowers and vegetables. And the way that promotion was done back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s and 60s was through exhibitions. These were very elaborate shows of vegetables, fruits, flowers, and so on. Our club organized those in Ridgefield, but we also participated in large exhibitions elsewhere. For example, at the International Flower Show, which was held every year in New York City. Anne and Edna organized our club's exhibitions for those shows in New York City. Here they are in 1935, getting the exhibit together. That's Edna, who's kind of crouched down lower, and Anne is behind her with the hat on. Here they are getting ready for the 1936 International Flower Show in New York City. That's Edna on the very far right. And then on the other side of the gentleman, who's Mr. Kelly, who was a well-known horticulturalist at the time, is Anne Richardson. I want to point out a couple other people in this photograph. The woman standing in the middle with a very, very tall geranium is Lucy Moffett Lynch. Lucy owned West Mountain Farm, the property of which is now Ridgefield Academy. And then if you look way over on the left, barely in view, crouched down over a box of geraniums, is the grandfather of John Pinchbeck. Many of you will know John. He is a longtime tree warden here in Ridgefield, just recently retired. His grandfather ran Pinchbeck Nurseries and was very active with the garden club during those years. These exhibitions held in New York City, they are on multiple floors of the Grand Central Palace, which no longer exists there, but it was in Midtown Manhattan. And tens of thousands of people would come through these exhibitions every week to look at what was being exhibited. These were, you can tell, it took many hands to put together the exhibits. And then here's 1939, and Anne Richardson is in the middle, leaning over one of the exhibits that she is organizing for our club. We're fortunate to have in our archives a film that was taken in 1939 at our club's 25th anniversary. The meeting was held at Lucy Moffett Lynch's house. Again, that's today Ridgefield Academy. And you can see Anne Richardson there with the white dress and the big yellow broad-rimmed hat. At this point, Anne has been in Ridgefield for 25 years. She's about 55 years old. She was our club's president for 3 years. She also chaired the vast majority of our club's committees during those first years that she was here. Unfortunately, we don't have labels for anyone other than, I know that's Anne Richardson, so we don't know who these particular ladies are. But one of the committees that Anne chaired for over 25 years, and that she was on for almost 40 years, was the Village Improvement Committee of the Ridgefield Garden Club. The Village Improvement Committee was formed in 1917. That was a couple of years after our club's founding, and it was formed after the Village Improvement Society of Ridgefield, which had been organized in 1899, turned over all of its responsibilities to the Garden Club. Village improvement societies were very common at that time in New England. Because there were no town services provided by towns, things like there was no highway department, there was no parks and recreation department, there was no roads department, there was no town dump, none of those things existed. So townspeople would organize village improvement societies to do that work. So once the Ridgefield Garden Club took over that responsibility in 1917, then it was our club that was organizing those activities. And Anne was the head of that, like I said, for over 25 years. So in addition to taking care of all of the roads in town and making sure that they were lit and they were plowed and everything, the committee also took care of all of the triangles that existed throughout town, like this one that's by Jesse Lee Church today. The committee also took care of the Ridgefield Cemetery, which was the old pre-Revolutionary War cemetery, which is currently on Creamery Lane. The graves are no longer there, but the space is maintained today by Kautatoa Garden Club. Back in the day, the Village Improvement Committee would make sure that trash was picked up from there, that it was regularly tended to, and so on. And the committee also designed and maintained and placed all of the street signs in town and any other signage. So if you look to the far right of this photograph, you'll see the design that the committee came up with for the signs and that were common throughout Ridgefield at that time. You can see that that's the Cass Gilbert fountain there in the First Congregational Church in the background. The Village Improvement Committee also worked with local businesses and with the state and others to have large billboards removed from the countryside so we could actually see the trees in the beautiful countryside. And again, this is Anne Richardson for most of these years was head of this committee. The primary focus of the committee, though, over the years was always Main Street. Not only taking care of the roads, but also the trees. And that was Anne Richardson's love, that the trees of Ridgefield. And she was very focused on preserving the trees, and if they died, replacing the trees. For many people, her name really is synonymous with trees. Here's a photograph of Anne shortly before she died. It was taken at what is now the old high school when a tree was planted there in her honor by the club. And then here's a photograph right after her death in which another tree is being planted in her honor, and this one is being planted at what was then called the Boys Club, the Ridgefield Boys and Girls Club of Ridgefield today. Richardson Park, which is the subject of part 2 of this presentation, is often called Ridgefield's Arboretum because Anne and Edna planted many trees there, and the town has continued to plant trees there in her honor. I talked a bit about her organizing the League of Women Voters, a Ridgefield chapter, and certainly she was a leader in town through her work with the Village Improvement Committee. But she was also involved in so many other things. She served 2 terms on the Board of Education. She was appointed to the town's first zoning commission. For 20 years, while she was chairman of the Village Improvement Committee, she advocated for a zoning function, a planning and zoning function. And finally, that happened in 1947, and she was appointed to that first commission. She was also appointed to the town's first park commission. And she was the head of several town committees during World War II. Here's a photograph of her taken at Ridgefield's 1942 Memorial Day Parade. And you can see her there front and center, marching with all of the town leaders at the front of the parade in her one of her uniforms from World War II. And this was a uniform that was part of when she was part of the Motor Transport Service. And this was a women's volunteer organization that provided transportation to Ridgefield residents during World War II when gas was rationed and it was very rare that people were able to drive. So these women would drive people to hospitals, to doctor's appointments, and so on. So she's in her uniform that she wore as part of that committee. In 1958, so this is, a good 10 years or so after the end of World War II, the remaining members of the Motor Transport Service got together and they donated this clock to the town. You can see Ann Richardson there. She's, I guess, fourth from the left, and you can see her again in a big wide-brimmed hat. And that clock still exists today in town, right by Deborah Ann's and Ridgefield Hardware. Ann was also very active with, at the time, it was called the Boys Club. She was one of 9 founding members of the organization, and she continued to fund it throughout her entire life. Here she is in 1964. She's receiving the club's highest honor, the Silver Keystone Award. And she was also very active at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. This is a still image from a 1939 film in our archives, and I'll be showing excerpts from that film in part 2 of this presentation, where Ann is hosting at Mamanasco Farm a number of leaders of St. Stephen's. You can see Ann on the right, second from the right, and on the very far left, I'll just point out that's Reverend Lusk. He was the longtime rector at St. Stephen's. His wife, Edna, is in the pink hat there. She was also a member of the Ridgefield Garden Club. When Edna Scheuer died in 1946, Ann donated the Caroline bells, the chimes that still ring at St. Stephen's today. And every year, even now, 55 years after Ann died, she still, through her will, provides money to St. Stephen's to keep those chimes in good working order. She also gives money to St. Stephen's every year to provide Christmas flowers in memory of Edna Scheuer and to provide August flowers at the church in memory of Edna's mother, Lizzie Scheuer. Ann died in 1965, and her death was front page news in the Ridgefield Press for several weeks in a row. If I zoom in here down to the lower left, you'll see that the photo, which isn't a very good one, it's from microfiche, but there's Ann Richardson as she turned the first shovelful of dirt at the site of the new Boys Club building on Governor Street. And this was how she was remembered in the Ridgefield Press. For 50 years, a leading citizen of Ridgefield and a moving spirit for its preservation and its betterment. She's buried in Bridgeport, where she was born, at the family plot. And you can see that she is buried right next to Edna Scheuer. Finally, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Ann as a philanthropist, because while she was certainly a philanthropist during her life, that work has continued long past her death. When she died in 1965, she made arrangements for the establishment of the Ann S. Richardson Fund, which since that time has given millions of dollars to many organizations across Ridgefield, Connecticut, and elsewhere. In 2019 alone, the fund provided over $575,000 to different nonprofits. I think it's interesting to take a look at the recommendations that Ann made when she died as far as how she wanted that money to be distributed. First of all, she listed 8 organizations, 2 of which are in Ridgefield. One is St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. The other is what is now the Boys and Girls Club of Ridgefield. She also specified how she wanted the money in Ridgefield to be distributed. If it went to a Ridgefield organization, she wanted it focused on programs that benefited low-income people, as well as programs that were of broad interest to the general community. And then finally, she specified how she would like to have the funds distributed to organizations in Connecticut, particularly in Fairfield County. And she was most interested in programs that support the independence of women, the lesbian and gay community, programs that encourage youth development, and programs that promote environmental conservation. But in addition to all of the money that she has given to so many organizations over the years, she also donated part of her property to the town when she died. When Anne died in 1965, McManus Farm consisted of 110 acres. She donated almost 30 of those acres to the town, stipulating that the house be torn down, the house that she and Edna has shared for so many years, and that it be a public park. And that is Richardson Park, which you can see shaded in green below and outlined in black. That is really the focus of part 2 of the presentation, which will be what McManus Farm looked like when she was there. And you can still see remnants of it today when you go to Richardson Park. So it'll be sort of a today and back in the day presentation. So I know this was quick, but I hope this gives you a sense of how important Anne Richardson was to Ridgefield and continues to be to Ridgefield. As a suffragist, as a world traveler, a garden club leader, a civic leader, and a philanthropist. So that is part 1 of the 2-part presentation. I hope that you'll be interested in also attending the part 2 presentation, which will really be focused on her home, which she called McManus Farm. Thank you.